In the summer of 1816, a man in Vermont sat down and recorded something that no one in living memory had ever seen: snow. In June, not a dusting, not an overnight frost. A full snowfall in the middle of what should have been summer that killed every green thing in his fields before it even had a chance. He wrote it down in his diary, and what strikes you when you read that entry is not the detail of the snow. It is the sentence that follows. He wrote simply that he did not know why. That is the sentence that opens this investigation, because the cause of that snow existed. It was real, it was enormous, and it was happening on the other side of the world. And no one in the Western Hemisphere had any idea it was coming. Welcome back to Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and this is the series where we pull forgotten cases from the archives of the 19th century and see what is actually there when you look closely. The strange artifacts, the vanished places, the unresolved files. And today we are opening one of the strangest files of them all. A geological event so large it bent the climate of the entire planet, and so poorly understood at the time that entire populations believed the world was genuinely ending. Not metaphorically, literally. If this is your first time here, I will ask you to subscribe to Epoch Reset, not because I want a number on a screen to go up, but because what we do here takes time. Real archival research, real cross-referencing with historical documents and scientific records. And if you stay until the end of this episode, there is something waiting for you about this story that I have not seen covered anywhere else. A connection so unexpected that the first time I found it in the record, I read it twice to make sure I had not misread it. And before we go further, drop a comment below right now, even if it is just one word. Tell me how much you know about what happened in 1816, because I want to know how deep this goes for you before we start digging together. Now, let us begin at the end of the world. Before the sky went wrong over Europe and America, something happened on an island that most people in the Western world had never heard of. And what happened there was, by any measure, the largest single explosion in recorded human history. The island is called Sumbawa. It sits in what is now Indonesia, in the chain of islands that stretches east from Java into the Pacific. In 1815, it was part of the Dutch East Indies, a colonial territory of such remote and peripheral concern to European governments that news from it traveled not in hours or days, but in weeks and months, carried by ship across an ocean that had no radio, no telegraph, no faster medium than wind and sail. On the northern peninsula of Sumbawa stood a mountain called Tambora. Before April of 1815, Tambora was one of the tallest peaks in all of Indonesia, rising to a height recorded at approximately 14,100 feet above sea level. It had been quiet for centuries. The magma chamber beneath it had been slowly filling, cooling, pressurizing, and no one on the island had any reason to expect what was coming. There had been some rumbling in 1812, a low, distant sound that some local accounts describe as being like cannon fire heard through fog. But mountains make noise sometimes. And life continued. Then came the 5th of April, 1815. On that evening, a modest eruption occurred, a kind of rehearsal, sending a plume of ash and a column of fire into the sky. The sound it made was extraordinary. It was heard on the island of Sulawesi, over 380 kilometers away. Officials in Batavia, on the island of Java, more than 1,200 kilometers distant, heard what they assumed was cannon fire and dispatched troops to investigate what they believed was a military attack. According to the account published by Thomas Stamford Raffles, then the British Lieutenant Governor of Java, commanders along the coast interpreted the sounds as distress signals from a ship and launched rescue boats to search the water for survivors. There were no ships. There was no attack. There was only a mountain. But the 5th of April was not the event. The 5th of April was, in the strange logic of geological catastrophe, merely the prologue. The evening of April 10, 1815, is when Tambora entered recorded history in a way that has never been matched since. At approximately 7 in the evening, 3 separate eruption columns rose from the mountain, climbed into the sky, and then merged into a single mass of superheated gas, rock, and ash. The eruption column reached an altitude of more than 43 kilometers, punching deep into the stratosphere. Rivers of incandescent ash poured down the mountain slopes at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, reaching the sea, boiling into it, killing everything in their path. The village of Tambora was erased. According to historical accounts from the period, at least 10,000 people died in the immediate event, incinerated, buried, or swept into the ocean. The explosion was heard on the island of Sumatra, more than 2,600 kilometers away. Some more recent analysis of historical records suggests the sound may have traveled even further, perhaps as far as Thailand and Laos. When it was over, Tambora was no longer the mountain it had been. It had lost more than 4,000 feet of its height. Where its summit had stood, there was now a caldera, approximately 6 kilometers across and over 600 meters deep. The mountain had not just erupted. A significant portion of it had ceased to exist. Now, the death toll from the immediate eruption was catastrophic. But the death toll from what Tambora sent into the atmosphere is a number that historians still debate, because it is difficult to separate cleanly from all the other things that were happening in the world in 1816 and 1817. Some estimates place the global death toll attributable to Tambora's effects in the tens of thousands. Others, when accounting for famine and disease across Asia, Europe, and North America, suggest figures approaching or exceeding 200,000 people. The Encyclopedia Britannica entry on the mountain describes the immediate local toll as at least 71,000. But here is what I want you to hold in your mind right now. All of that death, the immediate and the extended, the local and the global, came from one fundamental mechanism. Tambora sent an estimated 60 megatons of sulfur dioxide gas into the stratosphere. Once there, that sulfur combined with water vapor and formed a vast aerosol veil of microscopic sulfuric acid droplets, each droplet approximately 200 times finer than the width of a single human hair. That veil began to spread. It did not disperse in wind or rain. It could not be dispersed because it was in the stratosphere, above the weather systems that might have broken it up. It simply circled the planet. And as it circled, it began to do the one thing that no human civilization has ever been built to withstand. It started blocking the sun. What do you think it would feel like to watch summer fail to arrive and have absolutely no explanation for it? No satellite images, no meteorologists, no volcanic monitoring systems anywhere on the planet. Just a darkening sky and a cold that would not lift. Tell me what you think in the comments below. By the time the sulfur aerosol veil from Tambora had fully spread across the northern hemisphere, no one in Europe or North America was looking for it. They did not know to look. And that invisibility is what made what followed feel, to the people living through it, not like a natural disaster, but like divine punishment. The year 1816 arrived with no particular warning. The winter of 1815 to 1816 had been cold, but winters were cold. Spring came, or seemed to come. And then something began to go wrong in ways that accumulated slowly enough that most people did not recognize the pattern until it was too late to do anything about it. In New England, a persistent haze appeared in the spring and early summer of 1816, described in newspaper accounts of the time as a kind of dry fog. It reddened and dimmed the sunlight. It did not respond to wind. It did not clear after rain. It was, though no one would understand this until well into the 20th century, the stratospheric sulfate aerosol veil from Tambora, diffused and invisible as a distinct cloud, but measurably present in the sky above every person in the northern hemisphere. The Albany Advertiser in New York published an account on July 17th of that year describing temperatures so cold that fears were being raised about whether the corn crop could survive the month. The Times of London, in one of the more memorable lines in its archive from that period, printed the observation that the oldest inhabitants in the region could not recall a season so unfavorable. And then came June. In New England, 6 inches of snow fell on the 6th of June, 1816. This was not a light frost at altitude. This was a full snowfall in what should have been early summer. The snow killed crops that had barely emerged from the ground. In parts of Maine and Vermont, it occurred multiple times throughout what was technically the summer months. The records from this period, many of them preserved in county historical archives across New England, show farmers writing in their diaries with a particular quality of confusion that is almost painful to read today. They understood what a bad year looked like. They had seen cold springs before. But this was something different, and they knew it, and they did not know what it was. Across Europe, the picture was equally grim, but shaped differently by geography and by the particular disasters that the region had just come through. The Napoleonic Wars had ended in 1815. Europe was already exhausted, already short of grain, already politically fragile. Into this came a cold and wet summer that prevented crops from developing across Great Britain, France, Germany, and Switzerland. According to accounts from local government records in the German state of Württemberg, the summer of 1816 saw snowfall on the Swabian Jura Mountains in July. The harvest did not simply fail. The harvest across much of Central and Western Europe essentially did not happen. In regions of Germany and Switzerland, grain prices tripled within months. Families were reduced to boiling grass, nettles, and tree bark. A report preserved in the records of the German Historical Museum in Berlin describes people attempting to make something resembling bread from straw. In Ireland, already among the most vulnerable agricultural economies in Europe, the wheat, oat, and potato harvests failed. A typhus outbreak, later documented in medical literature as having been precipitated by the famine conditions, spread through the island and into Scotland and beyond. Between 1816 and 1819, major typhus epidemics swept across Ireland, Italy, Switzerland, and Scotland. In Great Britain and Ireland combined, period medical records suggest the disease killed more than 65,000 people before the outbreak subsided. In China, the disruption of the monsoon season caused by the aerosol veil produced catastrophic flooding in the Yangtze Valley. Records from the Yunnan province, previously one of the most agriculturally prosperous regions of southern China, document 3 consecutive years of record-low temperatures and flooding that decimated even rice crops, which are among the hardiest of agricultural staples. A Chinese poet named Li Yuyang documented what he witnessed in a work later translated and discussed in scholarly publications as the poetry of the 7 sorrows. In Switzerland, an engineer named Ignaz Venetz watched something unprecedented develop in the mountains. The summers of 1816 and 1817 were so cold that an ice dam formed beneath a tongue of the Gietro Glacier in the Val de Bagnes. The lake behind it grew. Venetz worked to drain it. He failed, and in June of 1818 the ice dam collapsed, sending a catastrophic flood down the valley that killed 40 people, according to contemporary accounts, destroying homes, bridges, and farmland that would take years to restore. But here is what I want to slow down on for a moment, because the ice dam and the flooded valley and the failed harvests are all the kinds of things that history can document. What is harder to document, and what the archival record only partially captures, is what this did to the interior lives of people who were experiencing it. Imagine standing in a field in July with a coat on, watching snow fall on crops you spent months planting, with no radio, no newspaper capable of explaining what was happening, and no scientific framework that could have told you this was temporary. Because the science did not yet exist. The connection between volcanic eruptions and global temperature change would not enter scientific consensus until after the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, nearly 70 years later. What did people believe was happening to them? We will get to that. But first, we need to stay in the cold a little longer, because the economic consequences of 1816 were something that historians have been untangling for 2 centuries. Food riots, arson, looting, military deployment to suppress crowds in city centers, bands of desperate men marching through the English countryside carrying flags that read bread or blood. This is not a description of the French Revolution. This is a description of 1816 and 1817 in what were considered, at the time, stable, functional societies. The economic cascade from the failed harvests of 1816 was immediate and severe in ways that the historical record makes unmistakably clear. When crops fail, grain prices rise. When grain prices rise, bread becomes unaffordable for the urban working poor. When bread becomes unaffordable, people do not simply accept it quietly. The food riots of 1816 and 1817 were, according to the historian John D. Post, whose 1977 book on the subject became a foundational text in this area of study, the most violent period of civil unrest on the European continent since the French Revolution. In England, disturbances broke out in the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Devon. Crowds gathered outside grain markets and bakeries. There were incidents of arson, looting, and destruction of property. Authorities in the Little Port area of Cambridgeshire faced a serious uprising in May of 1816, and the response from the justice system was severe. Contemporary court records show that 5 men were hanged for their participation in those events. An amnesty was offered to others, but the hangings were clearly intended as a warning, a message from a government that felt itself losing control of public order. In France, still reorganizing after Napoleon and the years of war, the crisis intersected with unresolved political tensions in ways that made the situation particularly volatile. A serious famine struck during the winter of 1816 to 1817, requiring, as documented in administrative records from the period, expenditures from the government that had not been anticipated or budgeted. The historical record from this period suggests that the severity of the unrest in different regions of France did not always correlate neatly with how bad the food shortage actually was in that region. Some of the most severely hit areas experienced relatively little organized violence, while areas with comparatively mild shortages were in states of near chaos. One explanation proposed in academic work on the period is that people who were already severely starving may have lacked the physical energy for organized violent protest, while those who merely feared hunger still had the strength to riot. In Germany, the crisis took a particularly dark turn. Rioters in some areas targeted Jewish communities in a series of attacks that some historians of antisemitism trace as a contributing factor in the climate that produced the Hep Hep riots of 1819, a widespread wave of anti-Jewish violence across German states that is documented in both contemporary newspaper accounts and later scholarly analysis. The connection between economic desperation and the search for a scapegoat is not unique to any time or place, but the 1816 famine offers a case study in how quickly that dynamic can activate when institutional stability is already fragile. In the United States, the crisis played out differently, shaped by the particular geography and economy of a young nation. Crop failures in New England were severe but stopped short of the famine conditions seen in parts of Europe. However, what they did produce was something that would permanently reshape the geography of the United States. Farmers who could not grow food on their rocky, frost-killed New England plots began leaving, not in small numbers. In a migration wave that historians have since documented and connected to the events of 1816, thousands of families left their ancestral farms in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts and moved west. Some accounts suggest that one family among those who left Vermont was led by a man named Joseph Smith, who eventually settled in western New York and, in the years that followed, founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The connection is circumstantial, and scholars of this period are careful to note that many factors shaped that migration. But the population movement is documented, and its timing is undeniable. The American territory of Indiana became a state in 1816. Illinois followed in 1818. The influx of settlers moving west to find viable farmland was a direct accelerant of what became known as westward expansion, and westward expansion would reshape the political, cultural, and physical landscape of the continent over the following century. A volcano on an island most of those settlers had never heard of may have been one of the forces that put them in motion. A thought from Eliot. If the pattern of this investigation is doing something to you, if the connections are starting to feel like they go further than you expected, that is exactly what Epoch Reset is designed to do. Every case we open leads somewhere unexpected. Subscribe to the channel so that when the next file opens, you are already in the room. Here is a question that I find genuinely difficult to sit with. What does a person believe when the sky starts behaving in ways that no living generation has ever seen, when the summer refuses to arrive, when the sun itself seems to be withdrawing, and no one, not the government, not the church, not the learned men at the universities, can offer a coherent explanation? What story do you tell yourself about what is happening to the world? The archival record from 1816 contains a remarkable diversity of answers to that question, and the range of explanations that people reached for tells us something important about what this event actually was. Not just a climatic disaster, but a crisis of meaning. The persistent haze and the dimmed, reddened sunlight that characterized 1816 were, to the scientific observers of the period, deeply puzzling. A stratospheric aerosol veil is not something that the early 19th century had any conceptual framework for. The natural philosophers of the day understood weather in terms of local conditions, seasonal cycles, and to some extent, astronomical influences. The idea that a volcanic eruption on one side of the planet could, over the course of months, alter the climate of the entire northern hemisphere was not part of any model available to them. What they could see was a sky that behaved strangely. Sunspots became visible to the naked eye through the dimmed solar disk, something that is specifically documented in reports from the northeastern United States. In parts of Europe, the sunsets turned extraordinary colors, deep reds and oranges and purples that painters documented on canvas with an accuracy that modern researchers have since confirmed corresponds to the optical effects of stratospheric sulfate aerosols. The painter J.M.W. Turner, working in England during and after this period, produced skyscapes of unusual atmospheric richness. Art historians have noted that his characteristic luminous, hazy skies began appearing in his work during exactly the years affected by the volcanic winter. A museum catalog note on his paintings from the 18-teens describes the atmospheric effects he rendered as consistent with what we now understand to have been the optical signature of the Tambora aerosol veil. The light he was painting was not romanticized imagination. It was what the sky actually looked like. Caspar David Friedrich, working in Germany, produced works from this period whose glowing, otherworldly sunsets have been similarly analyzed. The volcanic winter left itself in the paintings of the most perceptive visual artists of the age, recorded in oils because no other recording technology existed. But while the painters were documenting, the rural populations of Europe and North America were interpreting. And the interpretations that circulated most widely were not scientific ones. The most prevalent explanation, the one that appears again and again in letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts from the period, was religious. God was ending the world, or God was punishing humanity, or some great transgression had been committed and the cosmos was responding. In the German states, the historical record shows that the rural population in particular turned to supernatural explanations for what they were experiencing. In the densely populated and industrializing regions, the response was more likely to take the form of riots and political pressure. In the countryside, it was more likely to take the form of prayer, pilgrimage, and apocalyptic expectation. The bloody, reddened sky above New England prompted its own wave of interpretation. Some accounts from the period describe people gathering in churches or outdoors at night, watching the sky, trying to read it. The persistent dry fog that had settled over the northeastern United States and refused to be dispersed by wind or rain did not look like ordinary weather. It looked like something unprecedented, because it was. What is particularly striking about this aspect of the 1816 story is the near-total isolation of the interpretive communities from one another. In Europe, no one knew what the people of New England were experiencing. In New England, no one knew what was happening in Germany or Ireland, and no one anywhere in the Western world knew what had happened on Sumbawa, because the news had not arrived. Thomas Stamford Raffles in Java had written a detailed account of the eruption and its immediate effects, which would eventually be published and read in Europe. But the reports that reached European newspapers in late 1815 described a volcanic event in the Dutch East Indies in terms that gave no indication of its global significance. The connection between that eruption and the strange sky of 1816 was not made in any systematic or public way during the year itself. So the world of 1816 was a world in which the largest eruption in recorded history was happening. Its effects were visible on every continent in the Northern Hemisphere, and virtually no one who was experiencing those effects knew what was causing them. That is not a small thing. That is a civilization-scale information failure, and understanding it requires us to fully internalize what information meant in 1815 and 1816. A ship from the East Indies took months to reach European ports. News published in a Batavian newspaper in May of 1815 might reach London in September or October. And even when it arrived, the scientific vocabulary to connect a volcanic eruption in Indonesia with frost in New England in June did not exist. I genuinely want to know what you think about this. Does the information failure make the story more frightening or less? If people had known what was happening, would it have changed anything? Would knowing the cause have made the cold easier to endure? Or would the scale of the cause have made it worse? Tell me in the comments. On the night of June 16, 1816, in a rented mansion on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, a group of writers sat around a fire and could not sleep. The sky outside was wrong. The summer had not come. The rain had barely stopped for weeks, and someone proposed a contest. This is one of the most documented and most discussed moments in the history of Western literature, and I want to approach it with some care, because it has been romanticized to the point where the actual historical record sometimes gets lost beneath the legend. Let me tell you what the record actually shows. The Villa Diodati, a large house in the hamlet of Coloni near Geneva, had been rented from June 10th by the poet George Gordon Byron, who was at that point one of the most famous and most controversial literary figures in Britain. Byron had left England under pressure in April of 1816, fleeing the collapse of his marriage, rumors of an affair with his half-sister, and debts that had become unmanageable. He traveled with his personal physician, a young man named John William Polidori, who had accepted an agreement with Byron's publisher to keep a private diary of their journey and report on Byron's behavior. The nature of that arrangement says something interesting about the period's understanding of celebrity and surveillance. At Lake Geneva, Byron encountered Percy Bysshe Shelley, a poet of growing reputation, who was himself traveling under circumstances that were, by the standards of the day, deeply scandalous. Shelley had abandoned his first wife and their children and was traveling with an 18-year-old woman named Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who was the daughter of two of the most prominent radical thinkers in England, the philosopher William Godwin and the pioneering feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft. With them was Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, who had previously had an affair with Byron in London and was at that point carrying his child. The group was, by any reasonable assessment, a collection of people for whom the normal social architecture of Regency Britain had already completely broken down. They had come to Switzerland partly to escape the gossip. The gossip followed them. Contemporary reports note that tourists were rowing out onto the lake specifically to observe the notorious inhabitants of the villa from a safe distance. The weather made everything more intense. The diary Polidori kept, portions of which have been published and analyzed in scholarly literature on the Romantic period, describes the atmosphere of the summer in terms that make it clear the cold and the storms were a constant presence. The party spent extended periods indoors. They read to each other from a German anthology of ghost stories that had been translated into French, a collection called Phantasmagoriana, which contained tales of revenants, mysterious strangers, and the horror of the undead. And on one of those evenings, Byron proposed a contest. Each of them would write a ghost story. Byron produced a fragment based on vampire legends he had encountered in the Balkans, which he abandoned. Shelley began something based on his childhood and also abandoned it. John Polidori eventually produced a story called The Vampire, which was published in 1819 and which introduced into English literature the archetype of the aristocratic, predatory, dangerously attractive vampire that would eventually become the template for Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Mary Godwin, who was 18 years old at the time of the contest, could not initially think of anything. She sat through several evenings of conversations while the two poets talked about galvanism, about the experiments of Erasmus Darwin, who was said to have made dead matter move, about the possibility of reanimating dead tissue through electrical current. These conversations are documented both in Polidori's diary and in the preface Mary Shelley wrote for the 1831 edition of the novel she eventually produced, where she describes listening to the discussions as a, in her words, devout but nearly silent listener. Then, sometime between the 2nd and the 3rd of the morning of June 16th, according to an astronomical analysis published by researcher Donald Olson in 2011 that dated the event using the position of the moon, Mary had a waking vision. She saw, as she later described it, a pale student kneeling beside a thing he had assembled, horrified by what he had made. She wrote down what she had seen. She expanded it over the following months. And in January of 1818, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, was published anonymously in London. It was published anonymously because no one in that period would have easily accepted a novel of that ambition and philosophical depth from a woman who was, at the time of publication, only 20 years old. Now I want to make something explicit that often gets glossed over in the romantic retelling of this story. Frankenstein is, among many other things, a story about a man who creates life in conditions he cannot fully control, then is unable to accept or contain the consequences of what he has made. It is a story about hubris and about the terrible weight of unintended consequences. Mary Shelley wrote it in a summer when the unintended consequences of a geological event were killing people across the entire northern hemisphere. The sky outside her window was the wrong color. The summer had not arrived. People around her were frightened in ways they could not articulate. Whether she consciously understood the connection between those conditions and the themes she was developing, the historical record does not fully tell us. But the conditions were real, and they were exactly the kind of conditions that force a mind turned toward certain questions to confront them with unusual directness. The same summer produced another text of lasting consequence. Byron, confined to the villa by the relentless rain and cold, wrote a poem he called Darkness. It describes a vision of a world in which the sun has gone out, in which fires are lit from desperate burning of cities and forests, in which survivors clash over the last scraps of warmth and food. Art scholars and literary historians have long noted that this poem reads less like an imaginative vision and more like a description of what was actually happening in 1816. The sun had not gone out, literally, but it had dimmed perceptibly and measurably, and the cold and darkness that followed were producing exactly the social breakdown that Byron's poem envisions. He was writing, in verse, the news that no newspaper had yet learned to report. There is an invention in the archive of 1817 that almost no one connects to Tambora, an invention that emerged directly from the crisis that would go on to change the way human beings moved across the surface of the earth, and that sits in museums today as a piece of engineering history without the name of the volcano that arguably made it necessary ever appearing on the label. The bicycle, or rather, its direct ancestor. The Laufmaschine, which translates from German as running machine, was designed and first ridden publicly by a German nobleman and civil servant named Karl von Drais on the 12th of June, 1817. His first recorded journey was a round trip of approximately 13 to 14 kilometers between the city of Mannheim and a coaching inn along the Baden postal route, completed in just under an hour. Contemporary reports, including an account published in Saunders' newsletter in September of 1817, described the machine in detail. A seat on two wheels aligned front to back, a padded armrest for the rider to lean against, and a steering mechanism controlled by a small pole. The rider propelled it by pushing against the ground with their feet, like an adult-sized balance toy. No pedals, no chain, no gears. Just a wooden frame, two wheels, and a fundamental insight about how human balance works at speed. The question of why Drais invented the Laufmaschine has interested historians of technology for decades. Drais himself never wrote a clear explanation of his motivation, but his biographer, a scholar named Hans Erhard Lessing, examined the circumstantial evidence and concluded that the answer lay directly in the famine of 1816. The harvests had failed. Grain was scarce and expensive, and when grain is scarce and expensive, you do not feed it to horses if you can avoid it. Across Germany and much of Europe, horses were dying of starvation, being slaughtered for food, or simply becoming unaffordable to maintain. The horse, which was in 1816 the primary means of personal and light commercial transportation throughout Europe, was disappearing from daily life. Drais, observing this, asked a question that no one had quite asked before in that form. What if you could move faster than walking without an animal? What if the principles that made ice skating efficient could be applied to dry ground? The result was the Laufmaschine, sometimes called the Draisine in English, or the Draisienne in French, and nicknamed by the London Society dandies who briefly adopted it in 1819, the dandy horse or the hobby horse. It became, briefly, a fashionable craze in English society before cities began prohibiting its use on footpaths due to collisions with pedestrians. Then it faded, and for nearly half a century the basic idea sat dormant. The pedal-driven bicycle, as we recognize it today, did not emerge until the 1860s in France, but the principle was there in 1817, invented in direct response to a food crisis that itself existed because a volcano in Indonesia had altered the atmospheric chemistry of the planet 12 months earlier. Every person who has ever ridden a bicycle is in a chain of causation that can actually be traced through the historical record. Connected to Tambora, there is something else in this part of the story that I do not want to let pass without acknowledgement. The German chemist Justus von Liebig was 13 years old in 1816 and living in the city of Darmstadt, in what is now the state of Hesse. He witnessed the famine directly. He saw what the failure of crops did to the human bodies around him. Later in his life, he became one of the founders of organic chemistry and made major discoveries in agricultural chemistry, specifically in the science of mineral fertilizers and plant nutrition. His work contributed enormously to the development of the agricultural systems that have, in the modern era, made the kind of mass starvation that occurred in 1816 far less likely in the developed world. Liebig himself, writing later in life, connected his career choices to what he had seen as a child during the famine year. A volcano may have killed people across the northern hemisphere, and the boy who watched it happen may have spent his life building the tools to prevent it from happening again. The last thing about the immediate aftermath of 1816 that I want to put in front of you is the political dimension. The crisis of 1816 did not merely produce food riots that were suppressed by military force. In some places, it produced structural political change. In the German kingdom of Württemberg, the famine arrived almost simultaneously with the accession of a new king, Wilhelm I, who came to the throne in October of 1816. In direct response to the crisis, Wilhelm initiated a sweeping program of agricultural reform, ordered a new constitution, restructured the administration of the kingdom, and reduced government debt. Historical accounts of his early reign describe a ruler who understood, in a way that perhaps only someone governing in the middle of a catastrophe could understand, that the existing systems were not adequate to protect the people who depended on them. Württemberg, under Wilhelm, became, by the standards of that period, something of a model of reform governance. A volcano reaching across the world had shaken a political order until it reorganized itself. The connections keep extending outward. Historians studying the political upheavals of Europe in the 1830s and 1840s, a period of widespread revolutionary activity across the continent, have noted that many of the men who led or participated in those movements came of age during the famine years of 1816 and 1817. The argument is not deterministic, but there is a strand of scholarship that asks whether the generation shaped by the catastrophe of 1816, the generation that had experienced, as children or young adults, the complete failure of governments to explain or manage an environmental crisis, became the generation that later refused to accept the legitimacy of those governments without challenge. The record does not let us confirm this cleanly, but it does not let us dismiss it either. Before you leave, if this investigation has unsettled you in the best possible way, then Epoch Reset is doing its job. We open files that have been closed for too long. We ask the questions that the official record does not answer. Subscribe now, and let us keep looking together. The next file is already open on the desk. So let us come to the end of this file, and let me tell you the thing I promised at the beginning, the connection that made me read the record twice. When I started researching the 1816 famine for this episode, I was focused on the obvious story. The eruption, the climate change, the crop failures, the riots, the literary connections. All of that is documented. All of it is extraordinary. And all of it takes your breath away when you trace the chain of cause and effect across a planet that had no way to see itself as a whole system. But then I found the line in the historical record about the Dalton minimum. The Dalton minimum was a period of unusually low solar activity that ran roughly from about 1800 to 1820. During a solar minimum, the sun produces measurably less radiation than during periods of high solar activity. The global temperatures during the Dalton minimum were, as a result, already slightly lower than average for the period. The effect is modest when considered in isolation. But the Tambora eruption of 1815 did not occur in isolation. It occurred at the precise peak of this period of reduced solar output. The two effects combined, reduced solar radiation from below and the aerosol veil blocking solar radiation from above, in ways that amplified each other. And there is more. Between 1812 and 1815, a series of smaller volcanic eruptions had already occurred across the Indonesian archipelago, in the Caribbean, and in the Philippines, including the eruption of Mayon in the Philippines in 1814. Each of these had added its own, smaller contribution to the aerosol loading of the stratosphere. By the time Tambora erupted, the atmospheric conditions that would allow a volcanic event to produce a true volcanic winter were already partially in place. The record suggests, and this is where I want you to pay close attention, that what happened in 1816 was not simply a matter of one volcano causing one bad summer. What it appears to have been is a perfect alignment of multiple independent factors, each individually manageable, combining at the same moment in a way that produced something none of them could have produced alone. Reduced solar output, a series of preparatory eruptions, and then Tambora, the largest single discharge of volcanic material in recorded human history, arriving at the precise moment when the atmospheric conditions were most vulnerable to its effects. The scientific literature on this, including a comprehensive analysis published in a peer-reviewed climate science journal, describes it as a systematic interaction of climate forcings that has not been observed after any other large volcanic eruption since the early Stone Age. What I want you to sit with is the possibility embedded in that sentence. It is not that Tambora was uniquely powerful. It is that Tambora arrived at a uniquely vulnerable moment. The world in 1815 was already cold. It was already primed. And Tambora was the match that fell into an atmosphere that was, in a very specific sense, waiting for it. The people of 1816 did not know any of this. They saw a sky that was wrong and a summer that did not come, and they reached for the explanations available to them. Some built narrative around it, as Byron and Shelley did. Some invented their way through it, as Dreyfus did. Some were destroyed by it, as tens of thousands of anonymous farmers, laborers, and urban poor were destroyed by the famine and disease that followed. And some were, perhaps, transformed by it in ways they could only understand decades later, as the young Justus von Liebig, standing in the cold streets of Darmstadt, watching hunger come for the people around him. There is no resolution to the Tambora file in the sense that there is no mystery to finally solve. The eruption happened. The science, as we now understand it, explains the consequences. The connections to literature, technology, politics, and migration are documented in enough sources that the threads are real, even when some of them remain contested at the margins. But what the file leaves open is a question that I think is worth carrying with you. The connection between volcanic eruptions and global climate was not understood in 1816. It would not be understood for another 67 years. In the intervening decades, the people who had lived through the catastrophe, who had experienced firsthand what it felt like for the sky to malfunction and the food supply to collapse and the government to stand helpless and blank-faced before a crisis it could not explain, had no framework for what they had survived. They told stories about divine punishment and inexplicable cold. They wrote monster novels. They invented bicycles. They reformed kingdoms. They migrated westward into territories they did not fully know. And they carried, in their bodies and their memories and their children's memories, the trace of something they could not name. We can name it now. It was a volcano. It was a solar minimum. It was stratospheric chemistry operating on a scale no single human being could perceive. It was the world doing something the world does, occasionally, regardless of whether anyone is prepared. The question I want to leave you with, and the one I genuinely want you to answer in the comments below, is this. If something equivalent happened today, if a Tambora-scale eruption occurred in our era, with our communication systems and our satellite monitoring and our scientific understanding of what an aerosol veil can do to global temperatures, how much would knowing actually help? Would it change the economic consequences? Would it change the agricultural catastrophe? Would the knowledge that it was coming make the cold easier to bear, or would it only add a layer of dread to a season that was going to be terrible regardless? The record of 1816 cannot answer that, but I think the record of 1816 can at least make sure we are asking the right question. This has been Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter. The archive is always open. And if there is a file from the 19th century that you think deserves a closer look, something strange, something unresolved, something that the official account never quite explained to your satisfaction, tell me in the comments. The next case may be yours.